So we have questions now to the panel. We have quite a lot of them on the monitor. I might start there and then come to questions in the audience. I think the very first question that came in seems to have, yes, here it is, from Monica Giorgio, and it's a question to you, Ethan. It's, how do you believe we could adapt the strategies you started 25 years ago at DPA to the tobacco field? What would be possible?
I mean, the first and most urgent thing, I think, is to find philanthropic sources that have no connection whatsoever to the industry. Because that's the taint now. I mean, why, you know, if some of the consumer advocacy groups were able to build some real momentum to do it with no money whatsoever, you know, then maybe would they have a shot of getting in? We have no idea. But I mean, you know, the role that first a fellow named Richard Dennis and then more substantially George Soros played was in enabling sort of an independent voice. And right now, that's really what's missing. So I think that's a crucial thing right there. I think you know, the second thing is it's really the need to think as strategically as possible about how we evolve. I mentioned before the issue, you know, in suggesting that medical marijuana was the way we got there, I'm not suggesting that the medicalization of nicotine is the way to go there, to the right place, but it is to say that thinking outside the box in terms of strategies that can help shift the imagery of who is the consumer, who is the user, and being as innovative as possible about that. Thirdly, languaging. You know, sometimes I hear, as I become part of these tobacco harm reduction circles, a kind of us versus them, tobacco harm reduction versus tobacco control. And Harry mentioned this earlier, but we're all involved in tobacco control. And, you know, historically, the tobacco control community split, as I said before. But I think it's a mistake to call the other side the tobacco control folks and ourselves the harm reduction folks. You know, we are the tobacco control folks who favor harm reduction as part of a strategy. They are the tobacco control folks who are now turning their back on sensible control, at least as far as it involves current smokers, and becoming prohibitionists and absent ideologues. So I think attention to language is really important. You know, the other thing is, you know, in talking about, you know, one thing we realized in dealing with the international drug control system, you know, the treaties beginning 100 years ago to regulate drugs, and the treaties of 36, 61, 70, 88, and then of dealing with the UN agencies, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, the International Narcotics Control Board, INCB, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, CND, that basically, you know, the old adage that think global, act local, and all politics is local, that's really what's going to change things in a big way. I think, you know, I tend to advise people, whether you're thinking about, you know, people you want to raise money from, or whether you're thinking about broader strategies, there is no they there. You know, it's about individual opportunities, individual people or foundations when you're thinking about funding. But when you're thinking about opportunities, it's like, where is the government? And there's, you know, did New Zealand do something really innovative that's worth picking up on and running with? Is there an opening in this country in the less developed world? Is there a particular mayor or governor or whatever it might be in your country? Run where the opportunities exist and recognize there's two sorts of opportunities. One is when allies pop up. You know, I was fortunate when I was just getting going in the late 80s as a professor that the new mayor of Baltimore, you know, a black man, former prosecutor, Rhodes Scholar, Kurt Schmoke, stood up and said the same thing. We became the kind of academic-politician duo. Then it was a libertarian-minded Republican governor, Gary Johnson, in New Mexico in the year 1999-2000. And you seize those opportunities. The alternative opportunity that presents itself is when the opposition, the other side, goes too far, when they institute a ban. I remember, you know, we always had a hard time educating people about methadone maintenance and about the science and why that was methadone maintenance properly done is got the best odds of helping somebody who's been in trouble with illegal drugs. And we had a hard time. All the media would always focus on, you know, the people who were getting their methadone and then reselling it, or the ones doing both drugs, or the tragedies of a mother who left her methadone in the fridge and the kid died and stuff like that. And these were, you know, and that's why the public thought about it, and just substituting one addictive drug for another. And then my mayor in the late 90s, Rudy Giuliani, goes, I'm going to ban methadone. Huh? And at that point, the U.S. drug czar, General Barry McCaffrey, who was no great ally of reform, said, "What the hell?" And many of the abstinence-only treatment programs, which were not really into methadone at all, said, "Well, we didn't mean you should get rid of it." And in a way, Giuliani's overreach provided the best public education opportunity we'd ever had. So it's looking for those places where either good folks are running the right way and you can jump onto it and try to elevate, maximize those efforts, or where the other side is overreaching in a way that might, in fact, shock the conscience.
I think overreaching is a really good thing. I mean, that's where we come to a question that's just come in from Australia for you, Natalia, about the overreaching of the Australian government. It's from Andrew Thompson. It says, Australians can now only get nicotine for vape by subscription from doctors. Given their belief nicotine causes cancer, etc., it's failing. Is it really a practical approach to tobacco harm reduction? Do you think that the Australian government's overstepped, to pick up on Nathan's point, in the context of that question?
Asking me?
No, I'm asking. Sorry, I'm looking to the screen behind me rather than in front of me. To
no, it's very hard to, when you're on Zoom, you can't really figure out where people are looking at. Sorry. Well, I can speak for the region of the former Soviet Union, right? And that's unfortunately in the practice of harm reduction, it's a completely different universe. I mean, the experience of Australia is so different for Ukraine. I mean, here, not only people cannot speak of harm reduction products on prescription or just buying them in pharmacies. Here, harm reduction products have a very, very bad reputation because of the unbiased and fake information. For instance, just an example that a couple of months ago, there was this crazy campaign of billboards all over Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, showing a guy with an e-cigarette and saying that e-cigarette gives you black lungs, meaning lung cancer. That's just an example of how twisted, how perverted the campaign is about HRPs here in Ukraine, which is why I think that Australian experience right now is not that relevant to Ukraine in this sense, because I think we are on a little bit, or Russia or Kazakhstan or Georgia. I mean, take any country of the FCTC region. I think we're a little bit on a different level right now.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. And I think leading from Russia to Africa, we have a question for you, Jerry, which has a lot of likes, and it's what advice do you give to the African countries whose economies have for decades heavily relied on tobacco production?
Yeah. There are countries in Africa like Malawi where 60% of the foreign earnings come from tobacco, a huge proportion of GDP from tobacco. You have the sort of the strange situation that Malawi, for example, export tobacco and import cigarettes. So the farmers there are going to be in difficulties. So there's clearly parallel in what we're discussion in tobacco harm reduction and safer nicotine products. We should also be interested in agricultural transformation, because what will these farmers now be growing? In fact, there's a growing interest in growing marijuana in many of these countries, transitioning to other products. So there are ways out, but it has to be handled appropriately. But I think the other question for African countries is, what does tobacco harm reduction look like in those countries? What do the products look like? Because a lot of the stuff that we have here, it's expensive, it's fancy, it's driven by electricity. So can you develop local products, local reduced risk tobacco type products, snus type products? And so I think, and bearing in mind in many parts of Africa, it's not just smoking, but there's a range of other types of tobacco products. So, and that's something for the companies as well, for the big tobacco companies, because, making money now in Japan and Europe and North America. But, there's an obligation, I think, for them to begin to think about how and what kind of products could work in Africa.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, I think we should go to questions from the audience here. Are there any questions to the panel from the audience? Yes, we have We don't? We do.
Front row.
Front row.
Front row.
Front row. Okay, Martin? If you could just say where you're from so people know.
Hi, Martin Cullip, Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Jerry was talking about the Truth Initiative and how they don't tell the truth, basically. They came out with a report or a statement on September the 9th last month where obviously I think stung by the fact that everyone's saying that the WHO and all the anti-vaping forces do not recognise harm reduction. So no, of course we recognise harm reduction. We're very much in favour of harm reduction. And then proceeded to redefine what harm reduction means to them and said that they're in favour of harm reduction such as NRT, but only if it leads eventually to not using nicotine at all, which is just another way of saying quit or die in my opinion. So the WHO and all these organisations know what harm reduction is. You know, they don't talk about banning electric cars because it doesn't lead to quitting driving altogether. They know what vaccines are. They know what harm reduction measures are. So they're either refusing to accept what harm reduction is, or they just don't understand what harm reduction is. So how do you make them either accept harm reduction or even understand it?
Well, I think everyone can comment on that. Do you want to start, Ethan?
Yeah, I mean, I think what also Truth was responding to was, a whole number of things. You know, the possibility that FDA was going to approve this Views product, the e-cigarette product, as they did. It was also that wonderful initiative by Ken Warner, you know, remarkably distinguished economist, former dean at University of Michigan School of Public Health, who enlisted a majority of the past presidents of the SRNT, the Society for Research on Nicotine, and tobacco, to sign essentially, a publication, American Journal of Public Health, saying that harm reduction needs to be taken more seriously in the public health community. And the SRNT is not seen as a pro-harm reduction organization. So, I mean, that sort of effort that was, or when you look at the article when Cheryl Hilton and a number of others, who was the past president of Truth Initiative when it was pro-harm reduction, when they published in Science. I mean, I think things like that in the academic world, make a real difference. Unfortunately, there's not the consciousness or the funding to take those sorts. That SRNT publication that Ken Warner orchestrated in American Journal of Public Health, that Science, there's no enterprise out there that is putting that out into the public media attention, right? If the advocates for harm reduction had a fraction of the money that Bloomberg's putting into banning, then items like that would get global attention. And because academics don't tend to think about engaging the public in that way, and because there's really not any effective media. Effort, media promotion being done. So that's the real failing. But those initial efforts are definitely a step in the right way. I mean, the other fact, of course, was it was really quite remarkable under Trump when, Trump initially wanted to ban, vaping, right? His wife comes home, says, I think our kid's vaping or his friends are vaping, and he, calls the head of Health and Human Services and said, let's ban it, And then what happened was a little orchestrated campaign among Republicans who did some research showing that there were swing voters in key states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, who leaned towards Trump, either were, middle or his way, but who were basically saying, if you screw us and ban vaping, we're not going to vote for you. And launching a campaign, we vape, we vote. And that really made a difference. I mean, one of the books that's just been written about the Trump era, has a little anecdote of Trump blaming his former Health and Human Services, Azar, for him losing the election because he pushed him on the on that issue. So who knows if it's true, but there are effective, aspects of advocacy.
Yeah, Jerry, would you like to comment?
Just briefly, I think one of the things we should be pleased about is that, small vaping organizations, unpaid vaping advocates around the world, a bunch of pro-THR people who share, Gmail lists and so on, who write to WHO from time to time, is having a huge impact. That others are now getting scared about the impact that these groups have had. But there are probably 70, 80 vaping organizations globally. My guess is that their total income is probably under $100,000. There's a run on a shoestring. Some are relatively wealthy, which might mean a £15,000 a year budget. Most are run by volunteers, 2 or 3 people. But they do make a noise, and that noise certainly helps. But the key issue is, as you all know, is how you can beef that up. I mean, it's only the foundation which is funding the stop smoking work, and there's no money going into this. We tried for NNA to get money from Cancer Research UK, and bit difficult that. We prefer to give it to ASH. So nobody's putting that money behind these organisations, and the organisations that do have money are not engaging with vapers. Where are the vapers on the boards of trustees of the anti-smoking organisations? Where are they? They're not there. So a lot's been done with very little money, and if there were the sort of money that could be taken, so much more could be done. But the groups are in a quandary because there is money they could take, but as soon as they take money from e-cigarette companies or whatever, they fall into that trap of being accused of being in the pay of tobacco companies. So I think, a hell of a lot has happened to stave off bad things, and the letters that went before, the activity around the different COPs has been quite interested in almost postponing decisions at COPs. And to my mind, the more noise you can make and the more you can postpone things, which gives time for markets to develop, more people to be vaping and using safer nicotine products. That's kind of an interim position. So, you need to expand the use and try to stave off nasty bits of legislation. But the noise that's being made has had an impact, but could have so much more impact if there were more money.
Thank you, Jerry. Before we go to the next question in the room, Natalia, did you want to comment, or should we go to the next?
Yes, please. Yes, that's actually a very good question, and I often myself think about this. I know that WHO core people, as well as BI team, they do know the power and potential of harm reduction products. They recognize it. They are aware of scientific research. And that makes me very, very sad, because their tobacco control groups in the countries, all over the region, all over Eastern Europe, they're not told the truth. I mean, they genuinely do not know what harm reduction products are, what they can do, what they're capable of. And I think this is very dishonest and also not decent, this kind of behavior. So that actually creates like catch-22, where we, harm reduction product advocates, also find ourselves in. And how to find a way out from this catch-22, that's another puzzle we all have to put together.
Thank you, Natalia. Good point. Now, we've got another question in the room from Derek Yak.
Hi, this is a question for Natalia. It is, I think, striking how we're seeing the relatively rapid increase in a wide range of harm reduction products, whether it's in Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan. And those stories are not really making it through here to the UK. And this is often happening despite government, what they're doing, but it's driven by consumers and a wide range of companies getting their stuff to market. So my question to you is, what would be most helpful for many of the people, particularly here in the UK, who have incredible knowledge and talent? And I think that I would hope that they would spend less time really sort of on the nicety of UK policy, and rather getting into a plane now that they can and getting out to the countries. And maybe you could talk about the likely response you think they would get by taking the expertise and the knowledge of what is actually happening in the UK and how it could influence policies across the previous countries of the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Derek. That's a very good question. In fact, the example of UK has been very, very popular in Ukraine, in Russia, in the whole former Soviet Union region. Everybody looks up to the UK. However, when it goes to harm reduction products, that's still a very strange issue, and everybody starts questioning it. At the same time, we had lots of meetings with doctors last week, with policymakers, and everybody here in Ukraine was telling that it would be amazing to speak to policymakers in the UK, to speak to key researchers in the UK, to actually see those people and hear from them why tobacco harm reduction products are powerful, what kind of potential they have, why this is the product that doesn't kill. that is not dangerous for kids. Because one thing is when we say it here or write in the newspapers, another thing is it would be very, very, very powerful indeed if they actually hear from the UK people who stand behind HRPs, who stand in the government, in parliament, doctors. As Derek made a very good point today, it's doctors who actually should lead the way. And when smoking prevalence gets declined among doctors, it's a very good sign and a very good encouragement for other kinds of population all over the world. So I think UK can actually play a better role, a brighter role, a more outstanding, as an example, role model for the whole world in promoting harm reduction products.
Thank you, Natalia. I think that's right. Exported regulation or exported best practice is something we don't do really enough of. And I think it's a very good point. Think of what Japan could do to talk about what's happened with heat not burn in Japan. Think of what, yes, the UK could do in other parts of the world, and even what Sweden, if it got its act together, could talk about in terms of what's happened in Sweden in other parts of the world where snus would be a viable product. We have some good questions here, but I think we've got one more here in the room.
Hello, my name's David Skinner. I don't have a dog in this fight at all, so I'd just like to ask the panel on the theme, or going back to the theme of overreaching, do you consider that there might be a time in the future when a government will ban smoking? And going on from that, if they did, or got close to it with the decreasing numbers of people who do smoke, do you think there may be a time when a government in the future may say to those that are left who do smoke that we will no longer provide healthcare for you?
Who would like to take that?
Right, I'll take a bit of that. There is only one country in the world which has put strong bans on the purchase of cigarettes, and that's Bhutan, and they lifted that during COVID. But no, there are no countries which currently ban cigarettes, and I don't see that happening. I mean, there are moves to say, well, everybody born after whatever year won't be allowed to smoke, or won't be, try to move the age upwards. It's still going to be, strong pressures to not to start or to, whatever. You've got a product which is currently legal in every country in the world. You've got, legal production of tobacco in a huge number of countries. We've got this whole history of drug, attempts to eradicate coca growing in Colombia, and they've just arrested the most recent, big cartel guy, but the next guy will be in place within probably already. So you can't really ban something like smoking or ban tobacco, and that's why the tobacco harm reduction proposition is so much more attractive, because you're offering a choice. It's like saying, okay, we don't want any more pollution, we ban driving. You can't ban some of these products, but you have to offer the opportunities to shift in a different direction. And I think that's what's so attractive about the tobacco harm reduction proposition, because it nudges people, it allows people opportunities to make those choices which lead away from something they don't want to do.
Let me just add a few caveats to that, though, because I am a little more concerned about this. I look at the history of international drug control, and if you ask the question, how was it that so many countries all around the world signed on to the prohibition of cannabis, even though many didn't even know what it was? There was a persistent pressure coming from the U.S. government, et cetera. And if you have a key government like the U.S. or others that begins to get behind a more prohibitionist campaign, I could see some momentum beginning to build. And then just two other points. Some years ago, we did a poll, public opinion poll. We asked people if they would favor in the United States a federal law criminalizing cigarettes within the next 10 years. And by and large, something like 40+% of the public said yes, but the highest group with over 50% was two groups. One were conservative Christians, and the other group was young people. right? And the fact that young people were, were more and more accustomed to there being restrictions on cigarettes here and there, and they're thinking, here a ban, there a ban, everywhere a ban, let's ban the whole thing, basically. So I think we could see sentiment shift, and I think the last part of this is there's growing support, even within the tobacco harm reduction movement, for restricting the nicotine content in cigarettes to the point where they cease to be what we think of as cigarettes. And I think if that proceeds too far, where you're no longer allowed to sell cigarettes with any meaningful amount of nicotine in it, that will reduce the number of people smoking. It'll provide a shift to harm reduction devices to the extent it's available. But it also means when you're talking about 13% of the American population and maybe 13% of the global population or whatever it is, still smoking, that suggests to me that restricting the nicotine levels in cigarettes becomes something like a de facto ban, in which case one could see an explosion in the black market. I'm struck in tobacco control circles and even the harm reduction group that, coming out of illicit drugs, we're familiar with black markets, as I said earlier in my talk. But when people in tobacco control think of black markets, they think about something that's worth some billions of dollars around the world. There's some criminal organization involvement, not a lot of violence behind it. Big tobacco complicit in various ways in feeding their products into the black market. But if you go to the point of a kind of de facto ban by reducing nicotine yields, I'm concerned that you might see an explosion in that black market where it increases absolutely dramatically. And at the same time, when you look at the stigmatization and demonization of smokers, we know that has some positive public health effect in terms of discouraging young people. But, we're heading in a direction now where cigarette smokers are becoming as stigmatized and demonized as we typically thought about as illicit heroin users. So there's a whole range of things why I take everything Jerry's saying, I generally agree. But I say let's watch out for these variables out there.
This is an area I think you can probably maybe look a little bit to the industry on, because is it not recently that Philip Morris in the UK indicated that with the transition to less harmful products, it may be a place where it could actually remove cigarettes from the market. There's a lot of areas there, but there's a question here which I think is really important, and I want to make sure we do get it in. It's a question to Jerry. And it's, would there be a benefit to tobacco harm reduction advocates applying for access to the climate change COP, pointing out that the combustible tobacco puts CO2 and CO into the atmosphere?
I think no. I think the contribution of the CO2 into the atmosphere is probably pretty minimal. I did, when we had the CO2 crisis recently, with the lack of CO2 in the UK affecting food products and bags of crisps, I jokingly said every time you open a bag of crisps, a penguin dies. But the amount of CO2 coming from smokers, it's minimal. Nice move. But no, but clearly the issue is how do you get these voices heard at COP in a couple of weeks' time? The voices are not there. Many of us have been to COP and stood outside and shouted a little bit, but they ritually ban. They let people in, let the media in. They only have about 20 places for the public and the media. And the ritual thing every first day of COP is I spy strangers, I spy evil in the crowd and ban everybody. So.
That's a recent thing from the last few years and continues. Right. But we have to remember that at the initial part it is open until such time as there's a move to close it. Now at that point, countries can say no, we don't want to close it.
Sure.
Now there's an advocacy point.
Yeah, the point.
Governments don't have to close it, so I think we can. There's an opportunity.
Yeah, I don't think joining the climate COP, but I think there are avenues for exploring other bits of the UN system, particularly the human rights bits, to try to bring out some of the issues about human rights, access to safer products, and so on and so forth, which was used reasonably successful in the drugs field, where the human rights arguments were put to WHO and UNODC, and in fact led to harm reduction being adopted within the UN system for drug treatment, drugs. So I think there may be things to explore within the international system, but not necessarily at climate COP.
No. Well, we've only got a few minutes left. Now, I can ask the remaining 2 questions, but you'd have to all be very quick, or I can ask you alternatively to just say your last comments.
No.
Question.
Okay, questions, right. Are there any legal means to globally confront the opacity of the FCTC Secretariat and its exclusionary and anti-democratic character? Could this come from the UK, for example?
I think it should come from the UK, from Canada, from countries which have open standards about meetings and so on. I'm not sure it will. I mean, you mentioned that Canada stood up once on this. I think in the days of streaming and all the rest of it, there's no reason why these things shouldn't be open to all. But it will depend on a few countries pushing for the openness of the proceedings.
Okay, and I'll ask the last question. Why can't the WHO admit and inform openly that nicotine in itself is not what causes cancer? FDA does, but discreetly, unfortunately. It could save lives at no WHO budget at all. I guess, Ethan, that's probably one for
I mean, all I can imagine is that they think between, on the one hand, the conflicts and pressures from Bloomberg and folks like that, on the other hand, the fear that it'll send the wrong message. If somehow you say nicotine is okay, people won't get it. I'm guessing, but maybe Jerry knows better.
Okay, well, we're at time, so I'm going to say thank you to all. Natalia for joining us from Ukraine, Jerry and Ethan, thank you, and thank you to the audience for being so wonderful today.